You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing good. We're going to release this podcast a couple days after Thanksgiving, the Monday after Thanksgiving. And I'm just kind of wondering, what are you thankful for?
Air conditioning and fast internet.
And here I was thinking you were going to say family and friends.
Don't be crazy, man.
No, I was going to go with a tech answer too. So my answer is going to be passwordless. But guess what I spent the entire day doing? Or not the entire day, but it was a good hour and a half talking about how we're going to do self-service password resets and password synchronization and what all the password policies have to be in order for the synchronization not to break. And I guess what I started to realize was that all those years in IAM that kind of make me the dinosaur that I am, sure come in handy still.
Yeah, I mean, passwordless is cool, right? I think it's coming. We've been hearing it for a while. But guess what? There's still people with passwords out there. Still got to cover them too and support it. So, and the unhappy path is the part that most exploits are probably taking advantage of is, I forgot my password and kind of going through that. Or if they've reused their password and unfortunately, maybe you're getting, a rainbow, you're part of a rainbow table out there, which has, pretty much every breach password known to man covered. So it's important kind of cover. It's like, okay, we know we want to plan and design for the future, but we can't forget the present.
Yeah. The other thing that I find that, having, the good old gray hair experience is that a lot of the basic fundamentals of IT and your software development lifecycle, those things come in handy and they play out in IAM projects over and over again. And the example I'm going to give right now is something that's come up in one of my projects where the team I'm working with is asked for access to the dev environment during it's the QA environment, but they want to make changes as they're going through their QA process. And that's very much, not how normal software development projects go, where the testers are changing the system, right? Because then the developers don't know what was changed and they're asked to then solve problems that they're not sure how those came to be. So the analogy I was using today was, imagine that you were asked to fix a car and you're working on that car and then you step away and then the owner of the car comes over and starts working on it. Then you come back and you think it's in a certain place and the car should start now, and you go to start it and it's not working, and you go in and you discover, all these changes were made, and you have to kind of troubleshoot backwards. So I think that's ultimately why you prevent that from happening, right? The developers are responsible for creating a working environment, and having other people work on that environment, behind the scenes is just not acceptable. So really that's just basic software development. That's not specific to IAM, but you have to be able to bring that to the table when you're going into projects, because you never know when these kind of scenarios might pop up.
I think it's basic anything. You're telling the story, and for this is an audio podcast, but I was squinting real hard at you, like, what? the brow was furrowed, like, this doesn't make any sense. This shouldn't be rocket science, and it should be common knowledge, but common knowledge isn't so common sometimes. We did this when I was in the help desk. Is like, okay, you have like a long ticket of troubleshooting. You needed to document what you tried, so that as you were going along, if the ticket needed to be migrated, to another queue or whatever it might be, they knew what was already tried and they weren't wasting their time. I mean, this seems kind of like a no duh, but no duh, Jim.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things you gain with hard-earned experience, right?
Absolutely.
You can't learn it from a book.
Absolutely. Let's see. So what else we got going on before we get to our main topic, which is identity governance? I think we're after Thanksgiving. We'll probably be taking our normal sort of holiday break here towards the end of December. Give my tired, weary fingers and even worse voice a break for a couple of weeks as we sort of head into Christmas. But we've got a few more shows lined up after this one. But people shouldn't be surprised, as we normally do somewhere between like mid-December to like mid-January, take a few weeks break to kind of restock, recharge. That's usually my spot where I try to get some creative juices flowing and either come up with a new intro or, I think I'm okay with the logo right now. Probably, keep that for a little bit, but it's an opportunity for us to kind of reinvent and, keep things fresh. So keep an eye out for that in case something changes.
Yeah, sharpen the saw a little bit. But yeah, I think even slackers like us deserve a couple of weeks off, and it gives us an opportunity to kind of come back full steam. I mean, you think about it, this is going to be episode what, 190
Yep.
in 3.5 years, not even 3.5 years. So we're definitely exceeding the pace of one episode per week.
Yeah, which is a lot considering this is not our day job.
Exactly.
All right. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about identity governance? I'm very happy to have our guest on here. His name is Paul Mezzara. He's the Vice President of Strategy with Saviynt. Welcome to the show, Paul.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And one of the things we like to do when we have someone on for the first time is kind of find about their identity background and their origin story. I guess, how did you get into the IAM space? Is it something that chose you, or did you choose it?
Yeah, kind of a combination. I think I eventually it chose me, and then I decided to kind of to stay with it, so to speak. For me, it started back in right when the kind of internet started taking off, in terms of not just being a website that had little pretty things to look at or read, but so this is around the later '90s, and up to then I'd been a software developer. So I actually started out as what they call a TPF programmer, a mainframe programmer. The TPF is like an airline programming. And so, but I was able to kind of move into like a more Windows programming and learn Visual Basic. And then I picked up TCP/IP sockets. And so at that point, there was opportunity to go with, to start on this B2B extranet that Visa was working on. And at that point, they were looking at putting it on CompuServe. So that's kind of where it was back then. And so they said, okay, let's put this thing on the internet and see, what we could do with it, see what our member banks, because basically it was a way for member banks to kind of share information with Visa in kind of secure fashion. Nothing like top secret or transactions, but just information. And so it started out with kind of a proprietary kind of a tunnel firewall that the client had to load on their desktop, and then to do that secure communication. This was before SSL even. So then I actually helped implement SSL, and then a single sign-on. So that's kind of how I got into the whole IAM. And then from there, we had kind of a custom enrollment entitlement system. And so that was a lot of fun, right during the kind of internet boom in the early 2000s. And then from there, I kind of evolved more to like an architecture role, did some worked on some federation projects, and then eventually went to over to McKesson in the healthcare space. That was a lot of fun. Started there, very small beginnings too, and we kind of built out a shared service as part of the IT group for CIAM. We built a whole big platform to kind of host a lot of different customer and patient portals and pharmacy portals, and a lot of cool stuff using a lot of technologies you guys are all familiar with. And then a couple years ago, went to Gartner. So I had an opportunity to cover IGA, PAM, and CIAM there, and talk to a lot of clients, probably a lot of people that, like people that listen to your podcast, around what are the struggles that people are facing. And a lot of the struggles and challenges I had as a practitioner were very similar to what I was hearing out in the field. So it was kind of really nice to get that validation, confirmation out there that I wasn't the only one that kind of going through this, these challenges. So it's been a nice ride. And now I kind of dove into the vendor space now for about a year and a half. I've been with Saviynt, kind of as part of their strategy team. So kind of going full circle. So we'll see what's next. But yeah, I don't plan on stopping anytime soon.
Yeah, so you've been like neck deep in IGA now for a few years. I guess I got to ask about the Gartner stuff because I'm always curious. I guess, take me through like a typical day of what it's like to be, an analyst in this space where, like it or not, the Gartner Magic Quadrant is one of the tastemakers that's out there. I'd love to hear more kind of, what's that like?
Yeah, actually, a lot of people don't know. I was on a team that was like the former Burton Group. If you guys have heard of the Burton Group, Gartner bought the Burton Group, and they kind of created a technical professional part of Gartner. So I was on the IAM team for that particular group, and our focus was more around the architects and implementers, and we did the solution scorecard. I don't know if you're familiar with those. I did a bunch of those for IGA, and we had another team that did the Magic Quadrants and some of those reports. And it was great. Kind of we worked together, but we didn't really co-author any research with them. But yeah, I mean, the day in the life, I would say, it's a lot harder than it kind of looks, in the sense of all the different things you have to juggle. First of all, preparing for conferences, presentations, doing X amount of documents that you got to crank out, plus co-authoring, and then on top of that, you're talking to hundreds, if not thousands, of clients every year that call and ask, well, okay, you wrote about this, so how does that apply to me? Or what other questions do they have about general IGA, PAM, CIAM? And you guys know those three topics there, you could spend a whole life just with one of those. And so for me, it was like, okay, just constantly reading up on, vendors' offerings and solutions. And then plus we have to be thinking on the forefront too. So it was a lot. It was definitely a change from being a practitioner to an analyst. And I really did enjoy it. I think it's a really good job. I would recommend anybody who's interested in kind of making a change to kind of consider that. Of course, you have to be a good speaker, a good writer, and good technical, subject matter expert. And believe me, there's a lot of talented analysts out there, and it's very sort of competitive in terms of you have the best and the brightest, I think, in at Gartner. And so, if you think you're going to go in and kind of wow everybody, you're kind of, I felt sort of humbled, for, I thought, well, I'm 20 years in IAM, and here I come waltzing in, and oh, you're just you're the newbie guy. Okay, we'll see. So it was very, very fulfilling, but also very challenging.
I think it's refreshing to hear that everyone gets imposter syndrome sometimes.
Yeah,
You kind of
yes.
walk it into situations like, all right, well, I think I know what I'm talking about. And then you find out it's like, oh man, I don't know anywhere near as much as I thought I did. Yeah. So the solution scorecard, in my mind, is a lot more detail typically than
Yes.
the Magic Quadrant. I know, at least let's talk specifically on the Magic Quadrant itself. Gartner discontinued doing that, I think 3 years ago. I think 2019 was the last one. And I think the reason that I heard was that it was because it was so mature that they just wasn't really much value. And now they've, I think, pivoted into like a buyer's guide or something like that for that. I guess, is that something you agree with? Is the IGA market mature and there really isn't kind of a need to continue that research, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, you're right. I think they kind of pivoted to a market guide, and I think part of the issue was that it seemed as though over the last few years of that report that there was a lot of same players and not a whole lot of interesting developments or changes. And so, because of the criteria for the Magic Quadrant, you kind of have to have X number of dollars in sales, and there's a lot of kind of criteria even to get on there. And so Gartner was thinking, and again, I wasn't part of that decision. It was the kind of the other team, but from my perspective, what I saw was that they really wanted to try to include other people and include other vendors and give a kind of wider array of these are the kind of vendors. Like in the market guide, they'll talk about the IGA lights and the up and comers, the established, and so I thought it was good in that sense. But unfortunately, too, a lot of companies rely on that MQ upper right? So, most of the time they just kind of circle that upper right and say, okay, this is my scope, and I'm not going to look at anything else. And so, with it disappearing, it's like people were like, okay, what do we do now? So, but I think overall it's a good thing, because I don't recommend just circling that upper quadrant. I mean, you got to look at your unique use cases. Some of these niche vendors, maybe they're great, but they only are in Latin America or Europe. So, but if you're over there, hey, to me, that's almost like an upper right vendor right there. So I think it was a good move in that, they kind of broadened their research to include more vendors. And then at the same time, as you said, we're doing the scorecards. So the scorecards are really giving you the meat and potatoes about each vendor and comparing them. And so that was almost, okay, well, you got this scorecards now. So kind of almost gave you, a little bit different information, but I think more focused. So one is a market and the other was more for the architect implementers to really look at the capabilities, in great detail. Because frankly, the Magic Quadrant and critical capabilities, they kind of broke down the different capabilities, but they were not as deep. I mean, the scorecard we did was like 300 or something criteria for each vendor. So it was pretty massive, and it was good for me because it really gave me a chance to look at all the different vendors' capabilities and really understand where the kind of differences were.
And I'll bet that's probably been helpful because now you're with Saviynt, Vice President of Strategy. I guess I have, I got two more questions.
Yeah.
The first question, I'll let you answer it, is what is a Vice President of Strategy? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one of the areas that I'm focusing on is kind of trying to look a little further out. And, what attracted me to Saviynt really was the kind of innovation culture that they have there. And if you just look over time of what Saviynt's done, we've been pretty much on the forefront of IGA. And now we broke into the PAM Magic Quadrant as a visionary. So we're kind of looking at that converged solution, which we'll get into in a bit later. But so part of it is just making sure that we're always looking a little bit beyond our product releases and seeing what are some of the big rocks out there that we need to either avoid or kind of, incorporate into our overall strategy. And so it might not be, because in my title is product and market strategy. So there's the market aspects. It's like, so what should we do from a geo market standpoint, SMB or kind of big company. So I'm starting to look at all those and see, well, where does it make sense for Saviynt to enter into certain markets, geographies, et cetera. And, recently we came out with the Healthcare Identity Cloud, which is basically our Saviynt Enterprise Identity Cloud, which is the name of our product. And it's not a different offering, but it's geared towards the healthcare industry. That is kind of an overlay of configurations, best practices, accelerators, kind of things that help you as a healthcare organization to kind of get your feet off the ground much more quickly and kind of cater to your specific needs, like, EHR integration, for example. So those are kind of some of the things that I'm kind of trying to spearhead there at Saviynt.
And I know the solution comparison just came out from Gartner too about Saviynt, and you guys did pretty well in it. I guess I don't want to turn this again into a commercial for Saviynt, but were there any kind of takeaways or findings that kind of stuck out for you as you're kind of looking over what Gartner is telling you about your product now?
Yeah, I think I'd say it was very similar to the scorecards that we just. There was kind of two criteria. One is just the basic, what they call, I don't know the exact words, the core criteria, and then the competitive. So core is basically everything that you as a client expect that you're going to need from an IGA solution. And if it's missing, then you really need to justify why you would actually even go forward with that kind of solution. So we did extremely high there. And the other one was competitive, which is more differentiators, other use cases that might be a little more specialized in nature. And again, we were in the 90s for both of those. So I think not really a whole lot of surprises there in terms of it's very consistent with what the scorecard kind of came out with a couple of years ago. So I think it's more confirmation that, that we're still in a good leadership position in the space, and that hopefully that with this, that a lot more companies will recognize Saviynt and include us in kind of the as on their short list. So that's, I think, the goal there is to really be able to get on those short lists and be able to also being kind of a SaaS solution, making it easy. As you guys know, implementing solutions like an IGA are very difficult. So I think that's where we're kind of leading the way there, on those capabilities. But yeah, in terms of particular things, surprises, not a whole lot more confirmation.
So, Paul, you and I caught up the other day, and there's just one part of your background that I found so fascinating, which was your whole dive into the CIAM space, so Customer Identity Access Management. When you're at McKesson and you made the statement, yeah, we went out and got ForgeRock. It was around 2011. And I was thinking, okay, became aware of ForgeRock around 2013, 2014. McKesson was kind of like a marquee logo for them at the time. That took what I realized was that took guts, man, to go out there and select a vendor who was pretty much new, right? I mean, the product had just been spun off, I guess, by Sun as open source. So that took some guts. But it must have been fun too to like take this product and like do all the things that it was envisioned to do and be kind of a trailblazer in that respect. But I thought what was also cool about the conversation was like how many times you and I must have passed each other in the hallway at the ForgeRock conferences and things like that. And I didn't even know each other. So, but hey, eventually we got to know each other, and I'm glad you're here. And I wanted to and I'll turn this over to you in a second, but I wanted to pick on something that you had said to Jeff, is that you're the VP of product and marketing strategy. And I think that is pretty cool, because one of the big trends that I see happening in the market is around this converged IAM. So it's taking these product towers, whether it was, I think of in IAM like the three major towers being access management, IGA or identity management, whichever you want to call it, and privilege access management. And I see a shift away from kind of best of breed, like this is what we do it well, and then we partner with best of breed in the other areas, toward each of the vendors trying to build capabilities around multiple of these, towers, if you will. And so I kind of see where Saviynt started out was around IGA, but also now kind of like venturing into the PAM space, not into the single sign-on space. So I'm assuming that was an intentional part of your strategy. I guess I'll start there. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Definitely. We even actually started way back where Saviynt kind of did what we call now our application governance. It's our fine-grained entitlements kind of management part of the product, which we started out, the genesis was doing SAP, more of a SOD and kind of compliance angle. And then Saviynt grew more into a complete IGA suite. This was in the early days. And you're right. So now we're it's been several years. And as I mentioned, we did debut in the PAM Magic Quadrant as a visionary. So again, I think our innovation and kind of mindset, we thought, and again, even myself, when I thought about this at Gartner and we did some reporting on this, I mean, the PAM and IGA traditionally have been very separate, but it does make a lot of sense to have those two be together, in that you most definitely want your privileged users to have a whole governance controls around them. In fact, those are probably the most important ones that you want to make sure you have the whole life cycle management of those identities in your IGA system. So it made a lot of sense from those two to be together. And then the other thing is, as we're kind of going to more of a just-in-time, ephemeral type, nature of identities and access rights, it makes sense that your IGA solution and your PAM solution are together, because they also are both interfacing with those endpoint applications. And at times, we can generate on the fly, elevate your privilege, and then remove it as part of your privilege access. But then if you're non-privileged, we still have that same connectivity to be able to manage those entitlements. So we could do privilege and non-privilege with the same kind of connectivity that we already have. So based on the risk, if we might decide to have you, elevate if you're an elevated risk, we might decide to direct you to having session recording and a bunch of other controls on top. So I think it's going to continue to be, it's going to evolve into something much more dynamic, and kind of what we're doing in the future. And what we're starting to look at is that whole application access layer where, we can dynamically, elevate you and put those privilege access controls on the fly. It's not going to be so separate,
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering from a market philosophy, if you will. If you rewind the clock 4 or 5 years ago, the predominant message was around better together, right?
Mhm.
And it seems to me that this converged IAM approach is probably going to push away from that model, right? Because now companies are competing on different fronts, right?
Mhm.
It's going to be hard to find a best of breed mix that is the perfect set of capabilities to fit my need. I guess,
Mhm.
and I don't know which one's better from a customer standpoint, but let me put that question to you. What is better for customers? Is it, for this converged IAM trend to continue and to deepen, or is it better, or did they have it better before with, the better together approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that, because you had asked too about, well, what about access management and into the mix? And I think we've decided that we're partnering for that, and that, a lot of organizations in many cases pick their access management solution as part of, could be their collaboration suite or other things. And in many cases, why should we kind of try to compete with a lot of the access management solutions out there? And they're well established, fairly, I don't know, commoditized is maybe, I don't know the proper word. Of course, I don't want to put down any access management vendors, but they do a great job in what they do. But in a sense, the single sign-on federation space is fairly mature. Um, but then it becomes, it's almost like a different kind of a discipline. IGA and PAM are almost a different discipline that requires, I think, a real depth in how um, you kind of implement IGA. So I think we've had a lot of success in that, and so I would recommend for customers to, definitely if they want to try to reduce the number of tools that they have, and of course at the CISOs, I hear that there's 80 plus tools that they have to worry about. So definitely there's that push, and that probably at the top level of the organization, they're going to want to have less tools and maybe one or two throats to choke, and have overall better spend, reduce spending, the total cost of ownership. That's the word I was looking for. But
No,
yeah.
and I think that's right. I think that's right. I think what you're saying there is that an organization or as a buyer, we've got to figure out what we need, right? And
Yeah.
not overbuy just because, hey, something's got all these bells and whistles. But I will say it's an interesting time that this converged identity, converged IAM movement is taking place, because at the same time, each one of those towers, all three of them, are becoming much more complex than they've ever been. I mean, look at
Mhm.
access management with passwordless. Look at,
Yeah.
identity management with verified credential, and identity proofing. Look at, I think that's the biggest one, privilege access management. The space is just humongous when you talk
Mhm.
about managing privilege in the cloud, which basically all cloud infrastructure access is privileged access. So,
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
like, as much as we might want to go from 80 products to one, that might not be the right answer Having one throat
Yeah.
to choke. We all kind of understand what that's all about, but that's not necessarily the right answer, right?
Yeah. And I think for today, if you're looking at solutions today, I would definitely, obviously, if you could do a converged solution with as many solutions as possible, that's obviously great from a TCO and cost and support. But I would definitely don't compromise the functionality that you need. For systems such as IGA and PAM and access management, man, they're important. So they could really make or break your security posture. So you're not, it's not like you're getting some other software that's not mission critical. So I would definitely say, don't compromise in your requirements. And frankly, up to this point, I have not seen those that are offering kind of a lightweight IGA as part of access management or other solutions that I haven't seen a lot of progress where they've really are providing the depth of the functionality that say Saviynt and other IGA companies are providing. So again, there's acknowledgement there that is hard. IGA is not easy.
Well, I want to get into governance a little bit, and I think you hit on something that I tend to have a bone to pick with vendors in any space is they're selling you way more than you'll ever actually need or use. So I think of smaller IGA players that are out there like Atlantis, Securens, et cetera, that have very good products, and they might be good enough for the vast majority of the use cases that organization is trying to solve. So I find it interesting as we've kind of had this conversation go along, and obviously we've got the established dominant players like yourself and SailPoint and Omada and kind of others, and it's almost like we've gone full circle here, where we started off with platforms about 20 years ago, where it was like IBM, CA, Oracle. And everyone's like, oh, we don't like these big behemoths. They're not flexible enough, right? And then you have the upstarts, these little startups like SailPoint. Nobody knows who the heck they are, right? They came in and kind of helped disrupt things. And now it's like, we need an IGA tool. And now the industry is again shifting towards, okay, well, we need a converged tool, which in my mind, I hear that, I was like, well, that sounds like a platform to me, where you have a whole bunch of these things that are kind of working together. I want to get specifically into the governance side of things. I think a lot of organizations struggle with just basic identity governance. That's where, yourself,
Yes.
SailPoint, Omada, Atlantis, Securens, IBM, One Identity. I mean, there are dozens of products in this space. And
True.
I guess I'm curious, what, from your perspective, sitting in the shoes that you've had as both a Gartner analyst and now, on the vendor side of things with Saviynt, what is it that makes it so hard for people to actually do and do right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was privileged to one of my first report was at Gartner was guidance for successful IGA implementations, and got a chance to talk to a lot of Gartner clients about this document. And yeah, there's so many parts to answer that question, but I think that it always comes down to, if you think about IGA, it's almost like I think of the garbage in, garbage out kind of paradigm, in that your IGA is as good as the data that comes into it and the data that comes out. And there's so many opportunities to make mistakes that can result in hundreds, if not thousands, of people losing access or getting the wrong access, and then you getting a black eye because of it. As the IAM architect, and I've been there, not at that scale, but I've been on the side of oops, somehow all those 50 people got deprovisioned. And a lot of times it's okay. Well, HR, kicked something off, and we did what HR said. So a lot of it is understanding the data and making sure you have good data governance from all the way from your sources of truth all the way to the applications. And really, from a people process standpoint, even before you get an IGA solution, I should tell clients this at Gartner, document and understand all those business processes, and make sure who's responsible for what information and who's responsible for that business process, and get them on your side, because you're essentially automating a lot of that in the IGA tool. So I'd say that's one thing. The other is you always want to start with your business drivers, and at Gartner we had kind of this four square chart that said one was risk and compliance, the other was security, and the one other was operational efficiency, and now I forget the other one. But anyway, but my point is that you should always start from what are your business drivers, what are you trying to achieve, and what does the top management want to see in this solution. And it could change over time. It could be one of those, 1 year and then it changes to another. But if you're able to start and then define those use cases from the top drivers all the way down, that's going to help you kind of scope and prioritize your deployment. And that's kind of the other part of this answer, is that your deployment should be very well as thinly or kind of scoped, very carefully to, minimize the damage that if something goes wrong, that it's kind of minimized, so to speak. So, and I look at IGA as kind of I don't know if it's a Swiss Army knife, but there's so many little bells and whistles that are part of these tools that it's easy to, okay, hey, I got this new tool, and I'm just going to click the buttons and do a bunch of cool stuff. But that's really a mistake. And there's no manual that's going to tell you what to do at what time. And that's where you guys come in. That's where, implementers and people who are experienced at deployments come in. And that's kind of the last thing I'll say is bring someone in that really knows what they're doing. They have some battle scars. They've worked in your industry. They've deployed the tools that you've selected. And, it's all about minimizing the risk of going sideways.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there. I think this is something that, we talk with our clients all the time is, a lot of times, yes, you're purchasing the technology and kind of, what you want to get out of it. But your experience with that technology will be greatly impacted by whoever's putting it in place. So having people who have that experience and do have those battle scars, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Can kind of help you kind of keep things on the straight and narrow, keep you honest from like a capability standpoint. I got kind of a little side question here because, I think there are still a lot of companies that have not taken the plunge into an IGA platform for whatever reason it may be. It could be, the company size is really small and they're getting by with just a handful of people and it's probably overkill at that point. But I still see a lot of organizations that are quite big, hundreds, thousands of users that are not in the IGA space technically. They might have something like Microsoft Identity Manager or some sort of, kind of homegrown sort of semi-identity thing. Maybe it doesn't do the governance, maybe it just does the administration, right? I guess what I'm curious to hear your perspective on is, when is it the right time for an organization to invest in an IGA platform and say, okay, X served us well. I'll just pick on MIM. Microsoft Identity Manager served us well. We get by with it fine. But when is the right time to say, okay, we need to kind of graduate into modern identity management, and we think IGA is the right space to go?
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's a couple factors there. One would be, as you said, in most cases that you'll see the tools like MIM or maybe even spreadsheets, like people are doing access certifications by doing, CSV extracts and dumping it all into a database. And so there's a number of areas, I think, where companies are just going to start to feel the pain, of either they're going to get an audit finding or, God forbid, something happens, a compromise of some kind. So hopefully there's not that event that turns people to IGA, but I think a lot of it is the pain, and definitely at around 1,000 or so employees is where I think most companies will feel that pain, because it's just too hard to manage that manually. And as kind of Jim alluded to, the cloud infrastructure, every user is a privileged user. And if you look at the cloud entitlements themselves, that's kind of hundreds of thousands of entitlements that nobody really knows if it's being used, if they're being used or not. And are you overprivileged, which the answer is 99% yes. So there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense for kind of those organizations to start looking at IGA. And the other thing is, given now that these solutions are SaaS delivered, what we call it Gartner, basically, consumable in the cloud, you don't need to stand up servers and infrastructure, which you guys know back in the day was a pain in the rear. And so with that also comes, with these smaller organizations, they just don't have the staff to stand up a IAM solution. So now that they have a SaaS solution, I think there's very little reasons why not to, if you're kind of at that size to where it's just too painful to manage manually, and or regulations. I heard a stat a couple weeks ago about the privacy. There's like 75% of the world now has some sort of privacy regulations. And I know that's kind of more on the consumer side of things, but it's not going to go away anytime soon. There's going to be more regulations, and there's going to be probably some new cyber security laws and reporting and responsibility of reporting things. So I think it's just going to get even more imperative for every company to be, have a good cyber hygiene. And the IGA is definitely one of the tools that'll help you, in that journey.
I think that was a great answer. I was like, as you're going, I was like, oh, but did you think of, oh, wait, no, he just answered that. But the way I was going to put it was when to do IGA before it's too late. So that was that major event item that you brought up. Or, I mean, before you hit some kind of rapid growth. I mean, we worked with a company, Jeff and I, that quickly became 10,000 employees and did not have an IGA system in place. That's way beyond, too late.
Yeah, and I'll say one quick thing on that. Sorry to interrupt, but M&As and companies that do merge or divest without an IGA solution, it's like very difficult because you don't know what user has access to what. Like you guys say at the beginning of your podcast, it's all about who has access to what. And that's what IGA gives you that answer. And for those kind of M&A situations, or there's no way that you can figure that out easily when you're doing those sorts of M&As, and then maybe even partnerships. More and more, especially smaller companies, are partnering with other companies. So there's a lot of B2B relationships.
Because here's what happens. What happens. So we got this phrase in our industry of JML, joiner mover leader. I always love to fall back on add, remove, changes, but it's the same thing, right? You have to be able to provision access when people join, remove access when they leave the company, and you need to change access when they move around. So as you grow, if you don't have automation, the first thing to die off is that we deal with changes. The second thing to die off is that we remove people when they don't need access anymore, when they've left the organization. But we're always going to give people access because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if somebody doesn't have the access, they're going to squeak. So as you grow well beyond that ability to manage it manually, is those processes fall off and you just do the minimum to get by, and you become very insecure. So that was my answer there. I was going to say before it's too late, but not until you have the time to devote to doing it right. Because if you start a project and your SMEs don't have the bandwidth to support the project, you wind up spending a bunch of money for people to follow up with people to try and get things to work when they've got other priorities. And so I see this in my projects sometimes where it's like, hey, we've got the budget for implementing an IGA right now, but our HR team can't really support it, and our Azure team can't really support it, and our ticketing management team can't really support it. So you as the IAM, and this is on the integrator side, it's like you just sit there and you bug people and you send reminder emails and you join calls and nobody joins on the other side. So when you go into a project to implement IGA, just make sure you remember it's middleware. It doesn't do stuff by itself. It requires integration to all these other systems. And if the teams on the other end don't have time to support it, it's going to cost a lot more. It's going to go a lot slower.
Agree. Yeah. And you made a good point around, that's another kind of tenet of successful implementation, is that, if you're able to start like a year ahead of even choosing a vendor, and you just start socializing it, and you start getting the HRs and all the right teams kind of on board, and then they could and then they could just say, okay, I'm gonna kind of carve out a few hours or something, or make sure that my engineers have availability for you, next quarter. The worst thing is to kind of come up last minute and say, hey, I'm implementing the system this weekend. Can you support me? That's the way to make enemies. very quickly.
Make enemies and to not succeed.
Exactly.
So, hey, one last area that I wanted to touch on, going along this converged identity, and you guys really taking at least a secondary focus on privileged access management, however you want to define that. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but in terms of this privileged access management and the cloud specifically, so here's my perspective is that the IAM practitioners are inheriting a cloud environment at some point. So typically what I see is that some development team had a project to launch some applications and they get an AWS account and start doing it more in a modern way where they're doing containerization, they're doing DevOps, and then the IAM, we'll call it the IAM team, comes along and it's like, we've got to secure this. We got to take all the controls that we have in our on-prem environment. We need to apply those in the cloud. But they're behind the curve, right? All this stuff has already been built. So my question is, where do you think they should start? So should they start by doing, taking their existing IAM tools and trying to see how far they can get in the cloud with those? Is it that they should, really just, I don't know. Let me put that question to you. Where do you think the practitioner should start?
Yeah, and I think that's really why some of these solutions, I wrote a paper on this before they actually called it CIEM or KIM, but there's emergence of these vendors that address that specific use case around the cloud entitlements, and I think that's somewhat came up from the fact that I don't know, the stat is like 80 or 90% of organizations are multi-cloud. And so, yeah, you might have a strategy around your AWS or Azure kind of access management. But once you're multi-cloud, how is it you're going to kind of make sense of all of those entitlements and kind of from that place to answer who has access to what and what are they doing with it? So in some cases, if you have, right now, I believe, at least Saviynt, we've already had some sort of this built into our product around the cloud entitlements, and but other vendors have kind of done some acquisitions, like Microsoft acquired Cloud Knox, so that's part of their permissions management, and so I think there's some kind of movement going on in the market. I would anticipate there'd be similar things going on there. SailPoint acquired something, CyberArk built their own kind of KIM capability, so it's definitely an area that has arisen. So if you have a product already, obviously you may already have some of those capabilities built in, and therefore, like us, again, we have that capability. So I would recommend that if you don't, and you already have solutions built in, and you're looking for a kind of specialized solutions, make sure that they have supported integrations with a lot of the different, vendors.
So the answer you're more or less going with is the KIM answer. And that was interesting because I was kind of thinking that you're going to go with more of the governance IGA answer, which is like, hey, make sure that in your IGA system, you kind of know who has access to what, which maybe that's, and I kind of feel like KIM bolts onto that in a way.
I mean, that was always my opinion when we kind of came up with the acronym. It's Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. To me, that's IGA. But the market, vendors is kind of taking a different kind of approach. PAM vendors are jumping on the KIM bandwagon. So I guess from a vendor perspective, it may not always be inherent in the KIM in a IGA solution. Ours is. So I always thought you're right. They should be very tightly integrated or within the same solution. That would be my recommendation for sure.
So I have 3 questions for you. Is it Linux or Linux, tomato or tomato, KIM or KIM, or just answer that third one?
Yeah, it's definitely KIM. Yeah, so we came up with, instead of CIEM, which sounds a lot like CIAM, so we said, okay, also, I think there was another one we were looking at, cloud access management, CAM or something. We said, no, that's not going to work. So we thought CIM was kind of a cute way of, of calling CIEM without trying to confuse it. Yeah.
Put a name on a very complex problem.
Yeah, exactly.
I know we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about another passion of yours, which is classic cars. So we kind of end on a lighter note around here,
Yes.
kind of bring things up from the very heavy identity governance talk that we just had. I guess here's my first question for you. I guess, how do you define a classic car? And then the second part of that is, what is your ultimate classic car?
Yeah. Well, definitely a classic car that kind of from a purist standpoint would be something that's kind of at least is older than like a 70. I don't know. It's funny because I'm in a car club and we just updated our inclusion criteria from like a 72 and older to like 79. So I think somewhere in the 70s. I mean, you could argue. I'm sure there's people that want to make it, some 80s cars, but frankly, I think that in the 80s is really where things started going downhill with terms of cars and performance. But really, those classic cars, at least the way I look at it is, they have super big engines that don't get good gas mileage, unfortunately. For those of you out there, don't mean to offend anyone, but so it's basically, and they're like weigh a ton. If you look at them, man, they're just huge, cars, and they have really good looking interiors. A lot of them, maybe even more modeled after airplanes and stuff, the airplane interiors and things. So there's a lot of kind of different approaches to classic cars, but I would say definitely something in the 70s or earlier. It goes back all the way to the 30s, and something that could possibly be really fast and loud, and a lot of different colors too. Two-tone interiors and those kind of things. So my favorite, of course, is, I'm going to say, the classic car that I have is a 1964 Buick Riviera, and so the Riviera, that's first year they came out was 63. I got a 64. They call those the first generations. And they had a number of generations where they kind of changed the body style. But that's my favorite. From 63 to 65, the body style is, I think, the coolest. So if you guys, can check those out on the internet. But very different from the other 60s cars at the time. If you look at like the Impalas or the Thunderbird was kind of the first. The Ford Thunderbird was kind of the first. What they call personal luxury vehicle, and that was kind of what Ford was wanting to do. So, obviously Buick and others came out with their version. So definitely the Buick Riviera is my favorite so far. If I get another one, I'll let you know, as I might have to change my mind.
Jim, how about yourself? What do you got for a classic car?
So if I had to pick one, it would be the 57 Corvette. It's kind of a roadster. I mean, those cars are just like, they just scream luxury and performance, but not luxury. They scream performance from that era. And they're just, you can't help but turn your head when one goes by. So, but the thing is, I'm not that handy. So I'd have to buy one that somebody else restored. And I'd have to have a mechanic who would come and do repairs on it. So it would be a lot more expensive than just, getting one and restoring it myself. That's not going to happen. How about you, Jeff?
Well, I'm not much of a car guy. And we were kind of joking about this before we hit record. It's like, mine is going to be, we're probably like, oh, it's, the first Tesla Roadster or something like that, because I am a big fan of the electric vehicles. If I can have my fun answer, will be the DeLorean from Back to the Future. I'm going to call that classic only because it's from my past, my youth. I've always been a fan of the Lamborghini Diablo. I just love the way it looks. So more of like a supercar kind of classic. I think the whole point of that vehicle was like it had to be as fast as possible. I think it had to be at least, I'm not sure what the miles per hour were, but it had to be be able to go at least 315 kilometers per hour, which is crazy fast.
Whoa, that is fast.
Yeah, so that would probably be like my classic car. I don't think those goes back to the 70s, so I can't be part of Paul's club. But it's like any other industry where you're classic, right? All the music that I used to listen in high school is now on classic, radio stations. So at some point, you'll hear Nirvana on the old East station, and you're going to realize what the hell happened to my life. I'm so old. I think it was just yesterday. So Lamborghini Diablo will be my answer. Well,
I like the Countach, man. That was like the 80s.
Yeah, like the Miami Vice kind of swing, the door swinging open. Lamborghinis are sweet. All right, we've had a lot of good conversation today. Paul, I know we went a little bit longer than we probably anticipated, but really appreciate you kind of helping be part of this conversation and kind of share your expertise and viewpoints. We're going to go ahead and leave it, I think, for this week. We know now what our classic car selections are. We know a lot more about the IGA space and some of the things that people should be considering when it comes to deployments and selecting products and so forth. We also got some scoop on some Gartner stuff, which is pretty cool, and kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit. So thank you for that.
Awesome.
In our show notes, I'll have a link to Paul. Hopefully he's okay with me asking him for the first time on air. If he's okay with connecting with people on LinkedIn. So I'll have a link to that. I'll also have a link to Saviynt and their website, and kind of find out more about what Saviynt's up to from an identity perspective in our show notes, as well as links for Jim and I if people want to connect there. And we're always happy to continue the conversation. So you can also find us on the web. We're at identityattthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityattthecenter.com.